We invited one other guest to join us, who's Dr. Allan Hall, a researcher who's researched knowledge activism, along with a number of people in the room here who worked on his project. And he was actually flying to Argentina, I believe, and chose not to come back for our event. So he's down in Argentina. But yesterday at 4 o'clock, he sent me some insights that he would share if he were here. And Terry's going to read those to us now.
Great.
Oh, I didn't actually say anything more.
Yeah. So Dr. Allan Hall was from University of Windsor and then went to Memorial, and now he's living in BC. But his work around 2005 or 6 about knowledge activism was kind of like a light bulb kind of thing to us health and safety activists, because we don't often think about how it is that we do and what methods we use to do this. So Val asked me to read Allan's message, and she said, it's long, but it's also important that I couldn't even think of what not to say, maybe one sentence in here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read what Allan said, pretty much in its entirety, before I start my own stuff to tell you about some current knowledge activism that's going on out there right now as we speak. So Allan, he regrets coming here for 2 reasons. One, because he loves to talk about knowledge activism. And also, but he loves OCOW, and he loves his work with OCOW, and he loves the work of this organization, and also of John Odike, who he didn't want to miss the 30-year anniversary. So he was torn 2 ways to not be here. He says that OCOW plays a critical role in creating and providing the conditions needed to support knowledge activism. Through its educational role, consultation role, and research and advocacy role, it has encouraged and helped workers and their reps to realize and mobilize power of knowledge in all its forms as a vital means of getting improvements in health and safety conditions. And so he thanks OCOW and John and all for that. He wants to say a few words about knowledge activism. Now remember, he's the one who wrote about it first in 2005 and 6. When I try to describe the research I've done personally in the health and safety area, I describe it as trying to better understand how, when, and why workers and their reps act to challenge or improve the working conditions affecting their health and safety, which includes understanding when workers don't act and why they don't act. The simple answer to why workers don't act, which everyone here and indeed every worker understands, is that workers and reps don't have the power they need within their employment relationship to affect change. As unions have declined under the pressures of globalization and neoliberalism, and employment has become more insecure, the capacity of workers and reps to challenge and correct unsafe conditions has been substantially undermined. As Andy King and Lork's Labor OCOW Academic Research Collaborations recent research on reprisals show, when worker representatives are subject to threats, reprisals, and negative employment effects, that even detracts their voice more. And while the previous Liberal government promised to address the vulnerability of workers through the expert panel and subsequent OHS reforms and administrative changes, he says there's little evidence to suggest that any of those changes have made any difference, because none of them, surprisingly, address the core problem, which is the vulnerability of workers and worker reps to employer persuasion, threats, and reprisals. So despite these constraints, he says, the persistent work of activists, unions, and OCOW gives him hope that change can be achieved. He fully expects that the efforts of the people in this room today to encourage knowledge activism as a strategic approach to representation and to think and organize broadly in health and safety will make a big difference. He says, we all understand there's no one single golden solution to the lack of justice for workers. Labor as a collective and workers as individuals need to have strategies for how we achieve progress. Knowledge activism is an important avenue for using and exploiting the limited powers granted to worker reps in the current system. He said implied here is the need to recognize that as constrained as they are in terms of legislation and political power, because his early studies found a type of activist called political activists, the latest study kind of shows there's less of those. that health and safety committees and health and safety representation provides an opening for workers to influence their conditions. But how much of the influence depends quite significantly on whether reps can mobilize critical sources of power, including knowledge, communication, and persuasion, to exploit the openings offered within the risk discourses of globalizing businesses and neoliberal governments. He quotes Tucker there. In this context, knowledge activism offers an avenue that works in part because the representatives speak to management in their language, using their symbols and their logic to construct health and safety in terms of management interests. Put another way, knowledge activism emphasis on using knowledge to persuade management exploits certain spaces within the neoliberal and risk management approaches which offer different openings for change. He said, and if this is done well, and our reps do it well, he says, he's found, managers can be persuaded to make major changes, even at some cost, ultimately because they're ultimately convinced that the changes will work, that they will control risks and pay back to the firm in some measurable way. He says, one of the quotes from his research says in the study, when we bring an issue, we present a resolution all costed out. We've learned that if you come with a problem without a solution, they don't listen or they just delay. You just have to make the case. So he says this does not mean that workers in temporary agencies or sweatshops can readily achieve more health and safety representation just by adopting this orientation. This is where he's talking about the system changes we need to lobby for and use our powers for. That certain preconditions are essential for this work in any kind of sustained manner. And we do get some of this from our interviews as cited. He said, certainly some knowledge activist representatives note that it was only after there were positive changes in their management or a change in their ownership that they were able to develop their approach successfully. Still, we should stop assuming that reps with limited employment security have no capacity to shape managers' responses over time. As our interviews suggest, these reps also often work to craft a more responsive management culture by building relationships of trust, integrity, and value with supervisors, managers, and management joint committee members. As one person put it in his study, it took a bit of time showing my manager that it paid to make a change once and then a second time. When I showed him a third time, then he started to listen to me better from then on. Certainly it would be naive in the extreme to think that all we need to do is train representatives to be knowledge activists and all will be well in the current world of insecure employment. As acknowledged in Tony Dean's expert panel report, proactive and targeted enforcement with substantial and serious penalties for reprisals and other infractions are essential in the current labor market. So he's not holding his breath that better enforcement is going to come, but he said it's not going to be enough. We need to build more effective worker activism and resistance at the workplace level while orienting enforcement towards protecting better activism and reporting. Our LORC study and other research suggests that some reps can achieve this even when conditions where conventional collective power is limited. He said future research needs to better understand not only the value of collective power, but also what happens when power is absent. But the need for more research should not discourage actions to move as they are doing and to encourage and support knowledge activism in as many workplaces as possible. That's what Allan says for us, his advice. So thanks, Allan. Sorry you can't be here, but thank you very much for looking into this issue back then and for creating this basis. What I want to talk about today is some actual examples of knowledge activism that are going on right now. There's many of them, but I wanted to talk about a couple of them that are going on as we speak. And so I'm Terri Szymanski, used to be Terri Aversa, Health and Safety Officer at OPSU. Started as a correctional officer, worked for about 16 years there, but I got bored with the job pretty quickly. But I entertained myself by reading and representing workers at the workplace because there was a lot that needed to be fixed there. So I became, more interested in figuring out how to kind of affect change around me. So this blue book here is on the table at the back. This is kind of the culmination of the report, the latest report where Allan Hall and others like Andy King, John Odike, a group, looked back into Allan's studies about knowledge activism again and surveyed about 1,000 health and safety reps in Ontario and said, how and why do you do what you do? What activities do you focus on? So I'm not going to go through that in great detail, just to talk that Allan still found the technical representation style. And then there's the knowledge activism style. The main way I explain those differences is if I'm walking around carrying the green book, putting on my spectacles, looking in there to dictate what actions I can do, I'm a technical representative. If I say to a worker, I can't help you with workplace stress because it's not in the green book, I'm a technical representative. If I'm focusing on just my quarterly meetings and what I'm allowed to do, what the green book says I'm allowed to do, then I'm a technical representative. So what I'm going to be able to achieve is pretty limited, and I think that's what the moral of the story of knowledge activism is. You're going to rely on the legal processes, which are going to fail you. You're going to rely on what the book says. You're going to color within the lines of how the system thinks health and safety should be done. And I argue, and I think Don mentioned, and we've mentioned the Workers' Health and Safety Center, and the ways that we train workers is different than the way the system trains workers. And I think that reps can be triaged unwittingly, maybe wittingly, by the system into being a technical representative, because then there's less harm they can do, put it that way. I mean, just last week at a meeting, you know, when you're a knowledge activist trying to be in a meeting and trying to act like a knowledge activist, and someone says, oh, no, that's not how you interpret that. You know, you say, that's the system Kool-Aid and we're not going to drink it, you know, kind of thing. So knowledge activists, you know, they use more than the law. They still use the law when it's strategic to do so. We still use legal processes, try to change the system, but at the same time, being strategic to get our accomplishments or achievements or whatever's on our radar addressed without waiting for the law to catch up. So they know who the power is in the room. They know who supports this, what using strategic means, doing research, talking to other workers, forming relationships, gathering evidence, putting solutions. These activists use, by hook or by crook, whatever they can to make the change in health and safety, from their spot as a worker who doesn't run the organization, by hook or by crook, to have that change happen that makes workers safer and healthier. And so Allan, when they interviewed the 999 or 1,000, almost 1,000 health and safety reps, and then said, what activities do you focus on and what do you think is important? You know, they do things like they're persistent. They bring solutions. They educate the employer, like by showing them what's first of all, in the Health and Safety Act. You know, put rationales to why they want change. They ask for advice, and they listen to all the advice from 10 different spots, but then they go forward with what they think will work, because they do the work. So that's why I have insert heart and common sense. These are some of my phrases, not Allan's, but they're from the research. It gives you the spirit of it. It's like they'll find out, ask 10 people, then form out a good way forward. Insert heart and common sense. So that's what a knowledge activist does. They're not stopped. When someone has an interpretation, they're not stopped by that interpretation. You know, we can formulate the map as well. And so the knowledge activists do that. And so when you think about what we do in health and safety, and we've been really trying to use knowledge activism, especially to deal with workplace stress, psychosocial hazards, organizational factors that cause mental distress, you know, cause or contribute to mental distress, which can eventually lead to a diagnosis of some kind, issues in the workplace. So action starts when I think about, you know, some of the things, either the cooperative approach or the crisis approach. So back in 2012, when Canada released the standard for psychological health and safety, there was a lot of workplaces having media releases and employers declaring that they've adopted the standard. You know, that's it sounds cooperative. I call that the rubber stamp approach. So but I'm talking about when a workplace actually starts action to actually attend to psychological health and safety beyond just declaring. So I'm talking about a cooperative approach where a workplace discovers the standard and decides to take action in this area, versus a crisis approach where a toxic workplace ends up improving based on starting from a crisis. So I'm going to have some examples of each of those, because there's lots of different examples of those. But one early one that I had a community nursing organization right after the standard was released. Never heard of the standard, never did anything about it, except that the workers were having huge issues at their workplace. They didn't have enough time to do their work in the community nursing. They were dispatching them across the whole city. They were working forced overtime every day. There was bullying and harassment because there was a list of patients they had to see. They were being micromanaged, and so those workers started a process where they did the survey that the Mental Injury Toolkit released. And that was back in the days before it was online. They did it in paper. They met people in coffee shops. They got over an 80% response. It caused the parent organization to have the new, more collaborative management brought into the organization, where the local negotiated a whole new way of dispatching the calls, from a citywide dispatch to zone-based dispatching, where the nurses got to choose a zone in the city and they were dispatched within that zone. So that was an organizational change that changed the very way work was done in that organization. And it was done because there was a problem that workers collectively organized, did the survey to have the evidence. It turned anecdotes into evidence, and they negotiated that change at the workplace level. And so that was more than, supports for trauma and tertiary interventions, but that was actually changed the way that work was organized. That was an early example. The workers at the CBC had tabled what they call the Red Sky document 2 years before the Ghomeshi scandal. The workers had realized that they didn't have say in what went on at the workplace, and they were meeting off-site to say, how can we talk together about what the issues we need to address at our workplace are? And they started to make a list of not having enough say, feeling they couldn't leave when their shift was over because it was a really high work environment where it was frowned on if you left early. They eventually drafted a list. And they thought of 5 or 6 ideas of how to fix it that they wrote up in a 2 to 3 page document, and they tabled it to their employer and asked for some change. And the investigation report 2 years later said that the employer did a couple of things when they got that list, but that the action wasn't sufficient to stop the workplace from further deteriorating into when it was in the newspapers. But I want to primarily just talk very quickly and tell you about 3 workplaces that are doing this right now. So I have a local in St. Catharines. It's a small, about 30 people. Oh no, this is an office with about 30 people. Office work provides face-to-face service to members of the public. And what's going on at this workplace is this worker went to one of the OPSU educational programs on the weekend on her own time, where we were teaching the Action on Workplace Stress course from the toolkit that we developed with OCOW. And I got an email, and she had sent me a whole proposal that she had done based on her learnings of going to the educational and what was wrong at her workplace. She drafted a proposal that she had already tabled both at the Health and Safety Committee at work and with the Labor Management Committee at work. And so she was illustrating knowledge activism principles by just this course of action that she did, going to a course on her own time, learning stuff. She did her own other research because her report had a quote in it. She had it divided up into 7 areas. What was happening at her workplace and what her drove her to action was there was a lack of justice and respect. She said that in her office, when staff filed harassment complaints, they were brought into a room and said, okay, let's fix these relationships. But whenever a manager filed a harassment complaint, there was a great big huge investigation, fact-finding formal meetings, and then letters of discipline and reprimand to the staff. So there was 2 ways to handle harassment depending upon if the complainant was a staff member or a manager. So it was causing huge, huge issues. People were feeling distressed and isolated. They felt they couldn't even talk in the workplace because some of the harassment complaints filed by managers were conversations people were having about the management style in the workplace and stuff like that. So, and they were also facing higher levels of client aggression. So this is what led her to write this report that she wrote all on her own. She's a worker, works in this organization. The employer's issue, she describes all of this justice and respect stuff, the consequences and how people are feeling, the effects on staff. So what she proposed is that we work on this together. We do the COPSOC survey, figure out what organizational factors and processes we need to change here to improve our workplace. And can we do it? And so she presented this report, and her manager, she went 2 managers higher than her own. She went to the district manager, and they are going to be launching the survey not only in her office in the new year, 2020, but the district manager liked it and researched the tool so much he's going to use it in 4 other offices that he's responsible for. So that's one that's in the pipe, as I say. And good for her for doing that. She did that, and we're supporting from afar, feeding her resources, but she's primarily doing it on her own with us from afar. And I have another workplace that starts with the crisis approach as well. I have a local 133. This is a small group of about 30 people that work in the workplace that provides community mental health services. And I find a lot of times that the most toxic workplaces are smaller, because one of the big issues here is cliques. Cliques in the workplace, favoritism, differential treatment by management, fear of termination, rumors, tattling, lots of people off on sick leave. So this caused her to want to start something. So what does a health and safety rep do? Well, they make health and safety recommendations, and they deal with these psychosocial hazards as health and safety issues because we have statutory rights under the health and safety law to get responses to our recommendations and to bring issues forward and document them. So she drafted, the union local worked with their members on the joint committee to draft health and safety recs. But then, of course, you know, in a dysfunctional workplace that might also have a dysfunctional health and safety committee, it delays the process. So when you have cliques, then you've got different factions on the Joint Health and Safety Committee, which they start to, instead of talking about the real issue, they're talking about whether it's really a recommendation that needs a response. Or they don't understand that when the employer and workers are at the joint committee, that everyone has a joint committee hat on, and that it's not the joint committee that replies to your recommendations. You know, you try to get consensus at the joint committee, but the union has a right to make them to the employer. So what happens is that in dysfunctional workplaces, the real issues get masked by the process that's described in the Act. It's a technical process, bureaucratic processes that lead you into rabbit holes, arguing about whether something's a real recommendation rather than just answer the thing. And, you know, one of the recommendations was to do the stress survey. So, of course, even before the recommendation response came, the committee decides they're going to do that. So it's like taking, you know, trying to own the process and trying to control the process. So that's been delayed our launch of the survey in about a month. Because we also have the, a committee that plays bait and switch, that changes the meeting dates so that certain people can't attend. They change the date to a date that the union person can attend, so that then the survey gets off on a different, planned a different way. So we're dealing with all that at this workplace. But the bottom line is, when she went to her meeting and again, we work in the background with our members, and they go to the meeting, she was able to get agreement on, the three things: that how the steering committee is going to get formed, that all communications are going to have joint agreement and be jointly agreed to, so that we can affect tone and stuff in those. And we're going to invite OCAL to produce the survey link, which can take away some of this fighting. So the survey will be more like, when you drive your car into a car wash and put the two front wheels in a track, that a dysfunctional workplace and committee isn't going to be able to derail a survey that's designed like the OCAL one is. It's not like we have the employer hiring a consultant to do the survey that can change it any which way they like. So we're dealing with all this dysfunction, hoping at least if we can design a fair process that we can get through. And this requires knowledge activism from the workers, because to deal with all these things are issues that come up, but it's more than just following the Health and Safety Act, and you don't get those tips from that. So they've agreed on a timeline. It's already a little behind the timeline, but because now half the workplace is sitting on the steering committee. Remember I told you about the clicks and the this and the that. So so it's been quite a process. So we're a little delayed, but we are going to get those two tires in the thing and get started. So we're actually in the organized stage right now, and we're going to be launching the survey. I think they're meeting this coming week, and their only task is to decide what questions to put in or out of the survey, and is the drop-down menu for how to stratify the workplace correct. But what they're going to do together is, when they get the report, they're going to create a one-pager for general distribution to involve everyone in the workplace, is the idea. Not everyone likes a 27-page of graphs. So they'd create the one-pager. What does the survey say? And then on January 15th, they already have the regular staff meeting, where there's going to be a joint union and employer brainstorming session held. It's going to be facilitated by jointly. They're going to brainstorm ideas. We're going to flip chart them, and then we're going to open it up for a 2-week at least period for people to email a trusted person their other ideas on how to fix it. That's because of the people don't often feel comfortable speaking up when management and workers are in the room. So we need to have that private way for workers to provide their input. And that meeting is going to be the 15th. And then we'll take a couple of weeks, the trusted person, because it depends who it is. It could be the union president, it could be could be whoever. It varies who that trusted person is, because they'll keep all the individual suggestions anonymous and the names, and they'll take the themes and they'll create what we call a tabling document about, okay, what are the themes, what are the issues, and what are the recommendations. And it turns into a work plan. And then it goes into the work plan. Now, when the community nursing organization that I told you about did this, they didn't go at this to change the culture in the workplace, but they found a year later that after they changed the organization of work to the zone-based dispatching, that was an input and culture is actually an output. Because a year later, when I phoned her back and asked her how it was, she said the air is different here. So I always say, let's not you don't focus on culture, but the inputs that you put in are going to affect the culture eventually. So what we're trying to do with this local is, what she's trying to do in her local is, through this process, she's trying to come out the other side to make some changes that will affect that culture in that tattling workplace. But it was funny when I listened to Dawn and Andy and Alec earlier about And actually, Leo, about going to the minister, the third story is a little further along. This is a 2-year-long story. We're 2 years into this project. But back in 2014, so OPSU, obviously at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, we were in the newspaper calling for CAMH to be charged because workers were getting attacked in workplace violence in the workplace. And Nancy Pridham, who was the president then of our local 500, still is. So the Ministry of Labour did charge CAMH 3 times, I think. One of them in 2014, charges where the organization was to improve, et cetera, et cetera. So, but nothing really, there wasn't, I mean, sure, the employer probably changed some things, but it wasn't enough to feel a difference on the shop floor. So, because in 2016, there was a few big attacks, all quick within succession. The worker beaten in the dining room, then a cleaner being locked into a patient's room when the patient was hiding, got beaten up and couldn't call for help. And they were months from retirement. But the final straw came when the nurse was punched when she left a room and then dragged into a second room, etc. So you see the date on that was October 23rd. Well, the local presidents there, Nancy and the local president of the ONA local, realized that Minister of Labour Kevin Flynn was speaking at the PTSD Summit in Ontario, in Toronto, on 2 days later. So what did they do? They showed up at the PTSD Summit and asked for a meeting with the minister. And they said, we're not leaving until we meet with Minister Flynn on what's been going on at our workplace. And so they waited there all morning. And then after Minister Flynn gave his keynote address, his welcome for the morning, he came out to speak to them. Between them, they had 70 or 80 years of service as healthcare workers, the 2 of these ladies. They scheduled a meeting with them 2 days later. What happened was he ordered in his wrap and basically met with them over his lunch, 45 minutes. So they went and they talked to him about what was going on in their workplace. So even, years later, from when Leo and them went and set that meeting up with the ministers, there's still got sometimes, there's got to be lots of different tools in the drawer, and one of them is talking to leaders and political people. So they spoke to him, and one of the things they said is, our employer won't even listen to other employers who have practices that are better. We've been asking our employer to get in other employers who have leading practices, and they won't even get them in. Well, I think one of the things that Flynn did was a couple of months later, he did arrange for another hospital to invite CAMH to showcase their practices. But the worker activity continued. So the OPSU local created a petition, and ONA and OPSU went and petitioned outside their own workplace down on Queen Street in Toronto. They also picketed an Ontario Hospital Association employer conference in the next few days. And then ONA wrote the letter to the CEO of CAMH that something needs to change. And we had about 10 things in the letter that we wanted to start taking place. And Catherine Zahn's the current CEO of CAMH, and she's the one who read this letter and said, I'm going to change, yes, I'm going to work with you to change this. And so the workplace, one of the 10 demands or requests was that we have a workplace violence committee that Catherine Zahn sits on herself, personally, and that the unions sit on it and key high-up managers, etc. So we had the first meeting in 2017. And our locals didn't really think much might change. But they had this process that they had got opened up through that activity that didn't have to do with just relying on, their rights under the Health and Safety Act, but more their collective rights. So there was a big workplace violence committee, and at first, I remember the first meeting when, people were sitting on their phones and looking at their emails, and but I think Catherine had an agenda that they were going to participate in this, and she was going to work to make sure all her management was on board. So the first thing is we were designing the strategies of what had to be done, not just providing input on things that the employer tabled. That's the first thing, is the letter had said we need to do a few things. And one of them was, dealing with where the dead spots are in the facility where the alarms didn't work. And that workers, and so then if you're a worker at CAMH and you don't know where the dead spots are, all of a sudden these signs started to go up to label the dead spots. And that was a big deal for the workers, because the workers could see a change, and that was an important change, a very small one, because they had been trying for at least 7 years previously, trying to get information on where are the dead spots that the alarms don't work. So that was important. And then signs, zero tolerance for workplace violence signs in every elevator and all over the facility. That's a huge, it doesn't seem to be a huge thing, but it is a huge thing, and no healthcare facility liked at that time to use the word zero tolerance, but she may have been the first or the second to do so. But then she changed the name of her human resources department to people and experience, which is like an internal kind of way of recognition that she's changing the way she does things here. She changed the VP of Human Resources and Organizational Development to Vice President of People and Experience. And Carrie Fletcher, who now has that role, she was the one back in 2017 that was a lower level manager who Catherine had asked to do take over the employer co-chair role on the Joint Health and Safety Committee and fix things, change the way we operate. Involve the unions and the workers at the beginning, not after you have a draft of something. And Carrie had been the one to start that. Training for self-protection training for healthcare workers. I'm not going to go into that, but 3 days for all staff, which is more than just de-escalation training that most healthcare workers get, because we realize that workers need to be trained on what actually does happen, not what should happen. In a perfect world, you can de-escalate everybody. So why do I need to train you in self-protection? That's kind of how some healthcare facilities look at it, but you actually need to be trained for what does happen. Joint Health and Safety Committee training done. One of the 10 things on the list that we wrote to CAMH with was that there needs to be an external look at safety and how it's handled in high-risk areas, and all 90 recommendations are being implemented for that. Supervisor competency, 3 days training for all supervisors, and we're drafting that together now. We started with a program from PSHSA, that the only one that existed for healthcare specifically, but we weren't happy with it totally, because we wanted CAMH examples, so we're drafting it now jointly ourselves, and that's quite an interesting process, because we're also having deep-rooted discussions about health and safety and how it should be looked at. Even to how you categorize hazards. And this was where we were saying, that's the system Kool-Aid, and we're not going to drink it. The way that assumptions are made in the system about how health and safety should work, and we don't want those assumptions built into training for supervisors. So it's a very, very, very interesting process right now to have not only those discussions, but also how training should be delivered in adult style learning and not just talking heads at a PowerPoint. So, and the other initiatives were trauma services available for all staff over and above the EFAP program that they have. The COPE line, where there's 2 full-time psychologists that are available just for staff to talk over the phone, meet in person, go for a walk, etc. And then the senior VPs walk around with the union presidents and ask people on the floor how are things and what they need. And one said, we don't have a water cooler. And then it appeared a few weeks later, which the workers, you'd think that's small, but when the workers see that they've been here and they're gone, but a water cooler shows up, that somebody's listening to me. Somebody cares about me. So we still have, disagreements on what should be done for safety and how to get it, and what we still come up against what the employer is willing to do. But I would say for the most part, it's 100% better. We can at least have those conversations, and we're in the room to our locals, our workers are in the room to have those conversations, and they're actually helping form things as opposed to speaking on them after. So it's not that everybody's riding off into the sunset, because there's still lots of issues that come up that we address day to day, but at least there's a dialogue, and there's a dialogue where workers are in. And this never would have happened. The problems weren't solved with the 3 charges that the institution had. It took the petitions, it took the sit-in waiting for the Minister of Labour. It took a lot of this knowledge activist stuff to get this started. And so we'll just continue. So the 3 of them, there they are, Catherine Zahn, Nancy Pridham, and Danielle Larmond are the 2 local presidents, and the CEO that presented at the Workplace Violence Conference, the 6th Annual International Workplace Violence Conference, about not only how great things are, because things weren't great, and there's still times when things aren't great, but we're working. And workers feel a bit safer on the front line, and feel that they can bring issues forward, and they can speak up about issues. And that's really, I think, the biggest gain we've had with the project so far. So there's 3 examples of things that are happening, activity that's happening right now out there. Because bottom line is, we'll turn into skeletons waiting for something to happen. So someone has to be the knowledge activist in the room and call out the technical approach and call it out. Sometimes you feel like the one who's not playing nicely in the sandbox, but somebody has to be that, because we can't just accept the way health and safety is done is the right way, especially in healthcare. The more hierarchical the organization, the more of a strict view and a technical view that health and safety is. And so we have to call that out. And we're going to continue to follow your examples of the people that came before us, like Leo and Don and Andy, and with OCAL working with us, because OCAL believes this approach is important. And, thank you for providing the vehicle for us to learn and do this work, because it's worker voices. Workers are the experts. They do the work and they know. So we'll call it out and we'll continue. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.